Right now, many Oregonians are struggling to put food on the table. And if the U.S. House Republican plan becomes law, things could get a lot worse for Oregon families struggling to afford food. The rising cost of living, including the rising cost of food, has made life difficult for a lot of people across the country, and here in Oregon as well. One indicator that the rising cost of living is putting more pressure on families, making it harder for them to afford food, isn't the number of people visiting food pantries. The Oregon Food Bank reports that in 2024, it saw 2.5 million visits to food assistance sites. That was a 31% increase from the previous year, and it was also a record number of visits. So clearly, many families in Oregon, like families all across the country, are having a hard time getting the food that they need. So it's really disturbing to think that Congress is working on a plan that would take food assistance away from families. In late February, the Republican-controlled U.S. House of Representatives passed a budget resolution that, among other things, directs the House Agriculture Committee to cut $230 billion in the programs it oversees. And the biggest program that the House Agriculture Committee oversees is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, which used to be called food stamps. So, as observers have pointed out, to reach $230 billion in cuts, the House Committee on Agriculture will have to cut supplemental nutrition assistance. It's hard to overstate the importance of the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP. It's our nation's most important nutrition program. It's our first line of defense against hunger. Here in Oregon, more than 290,000 households use SNAP to put food on the table. That's about 17% of all the households in this state. In these households, they tend to have certain characteristics. Here are charts created by the U.S. Department of Agriculture that show the types of households in Oregon that use SNAP. As you can see, about 48% of the households participating in SNAP have a child. So, in other words, about half of all the households in Oregon that use SNAP are raising children. Also, more than 37% of households in the SNAP program here in Oregon have an elderly person in them. So, more than a third have a senior living in that household. And also, about 38% of the households have a person with a disability. So, again, more than a third of all households. In other words, cutting SNAP means taking food away from children, the elderly, people with disabilities, and the people who care for those kids, those seniors, and those folks with disabilities. And it's also taking food away from people who work, but still cannot afford the basics because their wages are too low. That's why it's mind boggling that the one member of Oregon's congressional delegation to have voted in favor of the House budget resolution, the budget blueprint that is threatening cuts to supplemental nutrition assistance and many other essential programs, is the one who represents Oregon's most rural congressional district, Cliff Bentz. Representative Bentz represents Oregon's second congressional district. Take a look at this map. The big area in dark blue is Oregon's second congressional district. It has the highest share of people who use supplemental nutrition assistance. More than 21%, more than 1 in 5 people in Oregon's second congressional district rely on SNAP to get the food that they need. Now, the House Republican plan doesn't spell out how it is that it would cut the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, but there's basically 3 ways those cuts could play out. Congress could reduce the amount of SNAP benefits that families receive. And the reality is that for many families, nutrition assistance already doesn't stretch far enough to cover the food for the entire month, which is part of the reason why so many families are turning to food pantries. Second, they could throw people off the program. They could deny SNAP benefits to categories of people. And third, they could shift the costs of the program to the states, which would put states in a serious bind in terms of how to come up with the money to pay for what the federal government has always paid for. Regardless of how exactly Congress went about cutting the SNAP program, Oregonians would suffer one way or another. And if the prospects of more Oregonians and people across the country going hungry isn't bad enough, the story actually gets worse. The reason why the House Republican plan calls for deep budget cuts to programs like SNAP is to pay for massive tax cuts, $4.5 trillion worth of tax cuts. Roughly half of all that money would go to the richest 5% of Americans, including billionaires. Imagine Oregon kids and seniors going hungry so that some rich person who doesn't need any more money can have a tax cut. It's just crazy. If there's any good news here, it's that the House Republican budget plan is not law yet. There's still time to affect the outcome. And perhaps the best thing that we can do here in Oregon is to make some noise. It's to let our members of Congress know that it's wrong to cut the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. It's wrong to take food away from people, especially when you're doing so just to pay for tax cuts for the rich.